Which brings us to Suzanne Dunne, our next participant, who was a contestant in FameLab Ireland in 2014, reaching the final there. She is a microbiologist that admits to having dabbled in molecular biology. She has done some work on the inner workings of the pharmaceutical and medical device industries, and she has gone back to research to complete a PhD in pharmacoepidemiology. She also describes herself as a recovering postmaster, which I think is all about leading celebrations rather than baking bread. But more excitingly, as far as I'm concerned, describes herself also as an avid collector of science jokes, which allows me to tell you my favourite. Entropy. It's not what it used to be. Moving swiftly on to our next participant, Suzanne Dunne.
I have to add that one to my collection. It wasn't there already. So, where I come from, we don't vacuum clean, we hoover. In America, they don't photocopy, they Xerox. And the next time you have a headache, I'll bet that you'll be far more likely to ask for aspirin than for acetylsalicylic acid. Some products are so successful that their brand name eventually becomes synonymous with the product. So this tells us something about the power of branding. And branding isn't just seen with consumer goods, it's also something that's made use of in the world of medicines. When a new medicine is approved, as I'm sure plenty of people in this room know, the brand name version is the only one that's on the market for very many years. Eventually, patents expire and the drug becomes open to generic competition. But when this happens, does the brand name still influence the medicines that we take? Many studies have shown that the vast majority of generic medicines are just as safe and effective as the brand name medicine, giving you the same treatment, often with much less impact on your pocket. But other research, my own included, has shown that consumers are sometimes sceptical about use of generics, with substantial numbers saying that, if they're given a choice, they would prefer to take the branded medication rather than a generic equivalent. Consumers often report that they are dissatisfied with the changing look of different varieties of the same medicine. And some consumers even say that, well, if something is cheaper, then it must not work quite as well. What I think is particularly interesting is that some research into generics makes reference to what's called the nocebo effect, which is the opposite of the placebo effect. So essentially what this means is that a patient who is receiving a generic medicine has already decided that it's not going to work for them, therefore it doesn't. Or maybe they have a preconceived idea that they're going to experience more side effects. Therefore, they do. And so the cycle of poor confidence continues. So here we have a situation where on the one hand, science is telling us a generic medicine will probably do exactly the same job, but on the other, public confidence isn't quite there. So is there anything that we can do to bring confidence and science together? Well, in this case, communication might just be the best medicine. We know that people who have a greater understanding of generic medicines are much more likely to accept and use them with confidence. And so, because we understand that people who have used a medicine in the past are more likely to use again in the future, the question we have to ask ourselves is, should we allow brand loyalty to influence the medicines that we take? So if you'll indulge me for one more second before I get booted off the stage, what I will leave you with is, to paraphrase the Bard, what's in a name? A medicine that we call by a brand name, by generic equivalent, might cure us just as well.
Questions from our judges. Pierre, I think your turn to go first.
Thank you. So, Suzanne, a very, very clear presentation.
Thank you.
So, when you talk about communication, is there an education component to each communication action in your world? And if so, what fora would you use to communicate and educate in your topic?
So, speaking very specifically about the world of generic medicines and consumer confidence in generic medicines, what I found in my own research, and this is repeated in other areas throughout the world, is that consumers have a very high level of trust and a very high level of confidence in healthcare professionals. So in the physicians that are prescribing their drugs, in the pharmacists that are dispensing their drugs. And a very little bit of information from these individuals can really sway people's opinions. And say in research that I've done, about 25% of the people that I interviewed told me, no, I actually would much prefer to take the brand name drug. But when I asked them then, well, if your GP said to you, this is the same drug, it's absolutely fine, would you accept it? They said, oh yes. So it went from about 25% of people saying no thank you to about 95% of people saying yes, if my GP tells me it's fine, then I'll be happy to take it. So I think that's where the information and the communication should come from.
Mary?
Can I, following on from that, push you a bit more about the epidemiology? What sort of research did you do? Did you just stop people in the streets, or was it a sort of more focused questionnaire?
So it was semi-structured interviews that were done in a quite structured fashion, but with the three main stakeholders. So I dealt with a group of patients. I also spoke to a group of pharmacists and to groups of physicians to get a feeling across the board of the main stakeholders in medicines provision and consumption about what their opinions are about generic medicines.
And numbers on that?
It was a qualitative study, so the numbers, they varied, different groups. Overall, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head for specific groups, but it was about 140 people overall across the three cohorts.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Suzanne, a couple of comments. Many of my physician friends tell me that their patients know so much about existing drugs because of the web and so on and so forth. I was also just thinking that sort of something like generic Viagra, for example, I don't think any patient will say they won't take it, etc. Is that fair?
One of the things that came up in the research that I did was that patients are very brand conscious. Well, I'm speaking very specifically now about Irish patients. Very brand conscious. They know the names of the drugs they want to take, and they will go to the physician saying, please give me X. And if they get a generically written prescription, they won't be too happy with it. Now, there are obviously implications for costs in public expenditure around health systems, but I think patients are they have a lot of information, but they don't have all of the information, and I think there is more communication there to be done to help give them a fuller picture of what's available to them.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. To follow up on Shaz's question, I'm sure we can all think of certain social circles in which anyone might not admit to taking generic Viagra.